And the internet's a lot like, well, I remember Japan became a leading, now China is, but Japan became the world's leading steel supplier for many years. And I remember going to a meeting in Tokyo with a steel person from another country who was telling about the Japanese absorption of steel technology. They had a meeting of the International Iron and Steel Association in Brussels. And you know, you come over from Japan or come over from the United States and go to one of these meetings and you're jet lagged, you're tired, there's a technical session at 8:30 in the morning, and he said that he walked into this meeting and everybody was lying down asleep. And suddenly 3 Japanese engineers walked in and began furiously taking notes. And that was one of the ways they absorbed the technology that allowed their steel industry to become #1. By the way, Schumpeter visited Japan in 1931 and was accorded a hero's reception because he was really preaching the principles that had underlay the Meiji Restoration. Yes, another question. You? Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. I just want to follow up with 2 comments that you made, and then I would like to see if you can elaborate a bit on the application in the modern day innovation for development. First of all, you did talk about innovation as being endogenous.
Yes.
Okay.
Endogenous.
Yeah, endogenous. Endogenous, yeah,
yes.
the economic system. You also did mention towards the end that technology transfer is also costly. Now, in the last 20-30 years, there has been some thought among economists and some development practitioners about appropriate technology for developing countries in the context that some type of technology has to be developed that are only applicable to developing countries.
Yes.
And that will help them to survive. Now, how do you interpret that in terms of the need for these countries to actually engage in knowledge creation and innovation?
Well, I think the first answer to that is that it requires entrepreneurship for a country that has been less developed to take a modern technology and adapt it to the local circumstances. And that requires effort, it requires time, it requires entrepreneurship. You need all these things. Now, you can shortcut the process by having a multinational firm come in and invest and set up the technology itself. And in many cases, they will find it necessary to have a little R&D operation to solve these problems of adaptation to the local economy. But various studies have shown that once a multinational comes into a new nation with a new technology, it spreads very, very slowly to other, now a different word, indigenous, local-based firms. That's the disadvantage of relying on a multinational. That's why the hard process of adapting a technology to local conditions is so very important. Yes, do we have a microphone there? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is still about these Korean experiences. Because in the literature of this technology catching up in East Asia, a lot of papers talking about policies this government implemented that utilize local content requirements, this hard bargaining with multinational firms in terms of technology transfer. But all these technology policy instruments now actually are not legitimized by the WTO rules. So it's kind of people arguing this, the ladder of climbing up in the value chain was kicked off. So particularly after these treaties were put in place in WTO, there's the patenting and these intellectual property rights were strengthened in the north, also in the south. So now, as the previous presentation showed by Latin America, a lot of countries have very small number of patents, and in those countries it means that very little absorptive capacity in those countries. So what's your view about these issues? It's more difficult for developing countries now to catching up to a soft technology right now than maybe several decades ago. So what's your view about this?
Well, that's a real dilemma. I've written quite a bit about the history of the formation of the WTO and the Treaty of Marrakesh. And the United States, well, actually there had been an earlier effort to get an international agreement on intellectual property. It failed because the United States was pushing for tough policies on intellectual property, and their European and Asian friends were not going along. So before the Uruguay round, or during the Uruguay round negotiations, the U.S. industry became smarter and teamed up with their European counterparts and their Japanese counterparts to form a united front and to say that the sine qua non of a World Trade Organization treaty had to be the granting of strong intellectual property rights by every member nation. I've always thought, I've written repeatedly, that this was a bad idea, and I noticed that this morning you had sessions on medicine where we have changed the policies, especially on pharmaceuticals. At first, the provisions of the Uruguay Round Treaty were such that everybody within a certain period of time had to give patent protection on new pharmaceuticals equal to that of the leading nations. Well, at the Doha round, this was challenged, and when it was taken to Hong Kong, it was formally adopted that the least developed countries would not, on pharmaceuticals, be required to comply for at least decades with these stringent intellectual property requirements. There was a conference in Norway in the year 2001 at which it was decided also that to get life-saving drugs out into less developed nations that had, for example, malaria and AIDS epidemics, that if the leading world multinationals were to sell in these nations their drugs, they were to sell at sharply discounted prices. And I feel I made a small contribution to that effort, and I feel it's one of the best contributions I've ever made in my life. Because following it, we did get widespread availability of anti-AIDS drugs at affordable prices. And we haven't defeated it, but we've made substantial inroads on the problem of AIDS. But this is a continuing dilemma about which we will continue to argue. Yes, there's a gentleman. And then there's a second, there's a little further on. Well,
yeah,
victory comes to the person with the microphone.
yeah, I also so. My question to you would be, the Schumpeter's theory on economic development has been, like a decade now. Are countries being able to implement a proper innovation policy till date, which is, based on the legacy of the Schumpeter's work? Are countries lacking? Is still, in implementing effective innovation policy. So, and what is the missing link yet?
What's the specific problem in India? I'm not an Indian expert.
No, it's not specific to India. Like it's in general perspective. But in India, we are still struggling with the innovation policy. We don't know what to do with it.
Well, look, it's difficult. Don't think it's easy, because it's hard. And you really have to work very hard at it. Let me give you two examples. As Japan lay devastated following World War II, its whole capital structure had been wiped out. And the question was, what should we do now industrially? And there was a great argument. On the one side were the economists, people like me, who said, look, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem of international trade says that nations that have little capital, as we in Japan have, and lots of labor, should produce and sell in international trade labor-intensive commodities such as textiles and pottery and things like that. That was their argument. Then, these were the economists who came from the central bank. Then there were the mostly engineers who were with MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, who said, yes, and if we follow that guidance, we will be poor forever. The MITI people won out. Japan adopted a policy of grabbing up and developing and adapting to its economy the latest technology in many different fields, in a succession of steps. And as a result, Japan became a technological powerhouse. Now, shift a little bit north to South Korea. Syngman Rhee, the first president, post-war president of South Korea, was overthrown by a military dictatorship by General Park Chung-hee. And after being president for a while, General Park, this is a different General Park from the one I put up here, President Park realized what was going on. They had followed some U.S. policies of providing protection to Korean manufacturing industries, import protection, okay, high tariff barriers. And General Park had arrested, put in jail, about 20 leading industrialists. He let them cool their heels in jail for a couple of days, and then he went to them and said, gentlemen, I know what you're doing. You're taking advantage of the high tariff barriers we have erected. You're charging high prices in Korea, and you're taking the profits resulting from these high prices and putting them in Swiss banks. I will let you out of jail when you promise me two things. Number one, that you will reinvest your profits in the development of Korean industry. And number two, that you will become competitive against the leading world producers. The rest, one can say, is history. That was the start of the Korean economic miracle. It's not easy, but it can be done. Yes. Okay, we have a gentleman.
If you're outside the prison.
We have a gentleman in back.
Thank you. My question is concerned with the limits of growth. The limits of growth. Innovation and technological change, etc. Are addressed to growth. But now we have a very pessimistic vision of the future with all this over-exploitation of our planet, overpopulation and so on. What, from your generation to this generation, what recommend you?
Yeah, well, what do we do? What was the limits to growth report, 1970 or thereabouts? And, well, there was a big debate. I remember Harold Barnett and Chandler Morse published a book on the limits to growth report in which they said, hey, there's no evidence at all that we've been held back by resource constraints, and they presented chart after chart after chart showing natural resource industries growing and with prices declining, and they said there's just no evidence. But now we're approaching a different barrier. The pollution barrier, the carbon dioxide barrier. People argue, I believe that indeed we have a very, very serious problem. I believe that through good technology, we can at least reduce that problem very substantially and gain ourselves another century at least of fairly good prosperity without severe climate problems. But, we need really, really good technological strategies to get from here to there. And number two, to get from here to there, we need to set up in our endogenous innovation market-based system, we need to set up appropriate economic incentives for investment in carbon-saving technologies. Nobody's done that yet. The Chinese have made some good strides, but nobody has really moved as far as we need to move. The problem is an economic problem. It's not a technological problem. So that's Mr.
I think on that note, I just want to really thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It helps us to get our ideas really kind of better organized and really consolidated around some key points. And I'm just very, very thrilled that you could spare the time to come and share both your perspectives, knowledge, and the enthusiasm about Schumpeter's thinking. So please join me in thanking